Okay, so is the GPT providing people with factual information in response, which of course it may do a poor job of, I'm sure in some circumstances, or is it simply asking them to interrogate the underlying basis for what it is that they believe?
Yeah, totally. It is not doing the Socratic method. It's not saying, oh, tell me, why do you think this? It's just being like, you think this? No, that's wrong. But not in an aggro way like that. For example, for this person that said that they thought 9/11 was an inside job, they're like, okay, the evidence that I see for it is that World Trade Center building number 7 collapsed, even though it wasn't hit by a plane. And also, Bush was reading a book to children, and when they come in to whisper in his ear that the plane had crashed into the Trade Center, he totally doesn't have any response at all. So he must have known. He wasn't surprised. Like, he knew it was going to happen. And then GPT-4 was like, I understand why I have questions about such a complex thing, blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, okay, the reason it's true that building 7 collapsed, even though it wasn't hit by a plane, but that's because it was hit by debris from one of the buildings that was hit by a plane, and that caused it to catch on fire. And it's true that Bush didn't respond, and people have argued about whether that was the right move or not, but he was trying to not cause a panic. It's not because he knew. And then the person's, okay, but what about all these reports that it was a controlled demolition purposely set up on the basement of the tower? And also, jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel girders in the towers. And then it's, yes, people have conjectured about this, but the things that sounded like explosions were actually just successive floors of the tower collapsing, making a booming sound. And it takes like months to set up a controlled demolition that big in the basement of a building. There's no way they could have done it without people seeing it. And it's true that jet fuel burns at 1,000 degrees Celsius and steel melts at 1,500 degrees Celsius. But a report by like the Steel whatever Union of America shows that steel loses 50% of its strength at 650 degrees Celsius. And so 1,000 degrees Celsius would be plenty strong enough to make it weak enough for the building to collapse. And so on. And incidentally, that person went from 100% believing it to 40% believing it.
Excellent. So let me ask you, was there a most prominent conspiracy theory that people seem to enter for the AI to consider?
In some of the experiments, so we did a few different versions of this experiment. In the first one, as we talked about,
1,000 people. The first sample?
The first one was 1,000, and then we did a replication with 2,000. In the first one, we started out by asking them how much they believed 15 common conspiracies. And so it primed those conspiracies. And so a lot of the ones they named were that. In the second version, we took that out. There's a lot of classic ones like JFK wasn't assassinated by a lone gunman, and something about Princess Diana. I don't know. That was like a less common one, but they're also, so there's like these kind of classic things, aliens, like government covering up evidence of aliens. But then there was like 2020 election fraud conspiracies, COVID conspiracies, climate change conspiracies, things like that. And one of the remarkable results was the effectiveness of the treatment didn't vary significantly across what the conspiracy theory was. Like across the gamut, it worked basically. I think one other thing about that was, to me, one of the most surprising parts of the result that we found is, so we got this 20% decrease right after the conversation. But then we followed up with the people 10 days later and 2 months later. And we figured that, okay, you get some temporary decrease, but then they would go back to believing it. There was no return to belief at all. It was just like totally like sustained reduction in belief, which I thought was really surprising. And our interpretation of it is this wasn't some kind of like persuasive trick. It was just, we actually taught people things essentially. Like they thought that, she thought that like the steel, like the jet fuel not burning hot enough to melt the steel was a compelling reason that it was an inside job, and corrected. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess that wasn't actually compelling. And then that creates like real lasting attitude change.